since we're at 9:30.
And
If it time's out, let me know.
they would be great. And they could get 20 of those. They could get cinder block like that. They could pick them up one at a time and dump them and make 4 hauls, and they better clean up a lot of them.
Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started this morning, but please feel free to get up and move around as you may need to. Before we dive into our topic, I want to ask you all if you would do me a favor. We've had some technical glitches the last couple of weeks, so if you would be willing, if you have a smartphone or a smartwatch, if you wouldn't mind just switching off your Wi-Fi for a little while, that would be helpful. Sometimes the wireless router in this room gets overloaded when everybody is connected to it, and we think that's why we've had some troubles the last couple of weeks, because this is an internet-based program. So if you would be willing to do that for me, I would very much appreciate that. I also want to say thank you to my friend Larry Mays over here in the back. Thank you very much for leading last week. You did a fine job, my friend. Youth at Convention was awesome, and so I really appreciate Larry making it possible for me to be there with our young people. I also want to share with you guys, so I told you that I'm a nerd when it comes to formation resources. So imagine my excitement that this book is hot off the press. It's called The Very Best Day, The Way of Love for Children. And it is precious. It's written by a family and children's minister at an Episcopal church in Texas. And the artwork is stunning, and the phrasing in here about the way of love is beautiful. So this would be a fun thing to share with your children, with your grandchildren, and you all can talk about the way of love with your families at home.
Order it online.
I'm going to get one for the library, so we'll have one in the church library. But yes, it's available. You can get it through Amazon, church publishing, wherever you'd like to pick it up.
Sarah, who wrote that? Who wrote that?
Roger Hutchison. He's the children's and family minister in Palmer, Texas, I believe. And Jerusalem Greer, who's the staff officer for Evangelism for the Episcopal Church, was also involved in the book. So it's good stuff. It's really good stuff. It's fun. Yeah. It's good. It is good. Yes, sir. All right. So we have looked at the practices of turning, learning, and praying. And today we are going to dive into the practice of worship. So as we always do, I'd like us to start with a prayer. So please pray this with me. Oh God,
His precious Son made himself known to his disciples in the breaking of bread. Open the eyes of our faith, that we may behold him in all his redeeming work, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
now if you're seated in this room, you're engaging in the practice of worship. So thank you for coming. That was the easiest presentation I've done. Have a good week now. Really and truly, I think that sometimes the practice of worship is really at the center of what we do as Christians. It is the center of our faith. But we don't always stop to think about what it means or why we do it. One of the gifts of the Episcopal Church that I just love, I did a brief stint with a non-denominational church while I was in college, and it didn't take me long to come running back to the Episcopal Church because the liturgy is just in my bones, and that's why I really enjoyed the worship experience that I had at the other church, but I just couldn't get away from the Holy Eucharist right too. It's just a part of who I am. It lives in my bones is what I like to say. But the pitfall to that can sometimes be that it feels pretty routine, right? We often do the same things and say the same words Sunday after Sunday, and as much as that's a gift, it can also become a bit routine to the point that, let's be honest, safe space. Does your shopping list ever run through your head during worship? Do you sometimes feel a little distracted from time to time? That can happen, and that's okay. That's okay. But it's important for us to remind ourselves why we are here. Whether this is your first Sunday at St. John's or you haven't missed a Sunday in 50, 60 years, it's important for us to be here and to talk about these things. So Bishop Buddy tells us that the way of love unapologetically affirms the spiritual importance of gathering weekly with other Christians around Jesus' table. The spiritual practice of worship is, by definition, communal. The gift of worshiping with others in the flesh and the opportunities for spiritual growth it affords are pearls of great price, well worth the effort and sacrifice required to fully experience them. The focus here in this practice on worship is on what lies at the center of a particular type of Christian worship found in sacramental faith traditions, including the Episcopal Church. It's always a good idea to go back to basics, so let's remind ourselves what a sacrament is. The word sacrament refers to rituals like baptism that are both symbols and portals of experience for a particular grace that only God can give. The Christian sacrament at the heart of worship is known in most Episcopal churches as Eucharist, which is a Greek word for thanksgiving. And this refers to our reenactment of Jesus' last meal with his disciples. Eucharist symbolizes and invites us to participate in Jesus' sacrificial love for all humankind. Moreover, there is at the heart of Eucharist the conviction that Jesus is present with us as he promised he would be. The mystical power of Eucharist explains why it became the central focus of worship whenever Jesus' followers gathered. When we feel that physical sensation of the wafer being pushed into our palm, when we drink from the cup, we are digesting the presence of Jesus. And the earliest records of Christian practice include this reenacted meal, because in it, our spiritual forebears felt his presence with them. And over 2,000 years later, so can we. And Bishop Buddy says that for her, the most poignant account in the Bible of the first experience the disciples had with Jesus' presence to them in the breaking of the bread and the drinking of the cup actually was not the Last Supper, but what we call the Road to Emmaus story. So let's look at that story, if you would come with me on the journey along the road. The story goes, now on that same day, 2 of the disciples were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. So what took place immediately before this story? The resurrection, yes. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" I love snarky Jesus. They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us." Aren't women the rabble-rousers? I'm just saying. "They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." And the women said, "What? I told you so." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they were coming near to the village of Emmaus to which they were going, Jesus walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." Now, in those times, it might not have been safe to be walking along the road at night, so they were probably just thinking they were going to extend this hospitality to the stranger. But you never know who you're going to welcome in, do you? So Jesus went in and stayed with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized Jesus, but he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" You think they're just kind of saying, "Oh, we knew who that was." But that same hour, they got up and returned to Jerusalem. They went from Emmaus and they ran back that 7 miles to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Wouldn't it be awesome if we all come to communion and say, "Were our hearts not burning within us?" Wouldn't that be great? Let's do it. Let's do it at 10:30. Bishop Buddy tells us that it's been said for those who follow Jesus, every road is a road to Emmaus. This is because we're all on the road to somewhere, and he's with us, but most of the time we don't recognize him. He is hidden in the people we meet, in the events of our lives and of the world, and even within ourselves in ways that we don't always feel. But once a week, or on Wednesdays at 12:10, Christians make the effort to show up in church. In community with others, we focus our attention on Jesus. We hear stories read aloud from his life and teachings. Someone takes the time, as Jesus did for the disciples on the road, to interpret the texts to us, bringing them into conversation with our lives. Sometimes when a person is speaking, we hear Jesus' voice speaking. We feel his presence. And I've heard a conversation with Bishop Curry where he's talking about the importance of worship. And he says it's so important because it discomforts us a little bit. It gets us out of our houses. It gets us to get up and put on at least something that looks relatively presentable, although come in jeans. Maybe that's not a popular opinion, but just come and be. But it gets us to come into a community of people, which helps us to decenter ourselves. It causes us to, as he says, unhinge ourselves from our self-centeredness. And then the action of worship, which is not a passive thing, it's an active thing to come and worship. It reminds us, now this is radical, that we're not God. That it's not all about us. It moves us beyond ourselves and focuses us on something beyond ourselves, towards the one who created all things. And that is important. We, as he says, we decenter ourselves and we recenter on God. And when we leave worship, that's how we go out into the world, not how we came in. But we go out recentered on God. If that's not important to do, I don't know what is. She tells us that Jesus also wants us to invite others to the table. And I would say it's not, of course, bring a friend. I am the director of Evangelism. Bring a friend to church. But it's also important to invite each other to the table. If you see someone that you've sat with for years that hasn't maybe felt comfortable coming forward, or just, is coming from a place where they're having a hard time going to the table for whatever reason it might be, wait and go with them. Say to them during the piece, let's go together. I'll come up with you. So invite each other and others to the table so that they too might experience his presence with them and love for them. Sometimes we in the church mistakenly assume that what we have to offer others in worship is ourselves. We're a great church, we tell ourselves, and no doubt we are. Our presence is important, as is the authenticity of our welcome and vibrancy of our spiritual life. But what sets Christian community apart from any other gathering is Jesus' presence at the heart of our worship. Our worship on Sundays and at 12:10 on Wednesdays culminates in communion. After we have communion, what do? We say a prayer, we sing a song, we get a blessing, and we leave. So everything we do culminates in coming to the table and meeting Jesus there in the presence that he's in the body, in the bread and the wine. So that is why it's at the heart of our worship. And because we share the experience of his presence, we feel a particular bond with one another. And that is the gift of being a part of a Christian community. We come together week after week. We come as we are, and that bonds us together. We're not just a congregation. Whether you like it or not, we're a family. And that is the gift of Christian community. For theologian Marcus Borg, Christianity is most fruitfully experienced and understood as a way of life rather than a system of belief. We've heard Bishop Buddy call it before a way of being in the world. Beliefs are important. Do not mishear me. Beliefs are important. But when we assume that Christianity is primarily about accepting as true a belief system, we risk placing too much emphasis on what we think or feel rather than how we live. It is through living the Christian life that we are given insights and experiences that take root within us as core conviction. It's an action. Worship is a verb. It's not a passive thing. Now, we have to start somewhere. You got to have, all of us have a belief in something that brought us here today. But what are we going to do with it? We come together to worship. We participate in that action. And then we are formed and shaped in our convictions by that action. And the writer Anne Lamott touches on this in a slightly different way. She wrote an essay about why she took her then 9-year-old son, Sam, to church, why she would drag him to church even on the days that he might not want to go. I have a 9-year-old today. We have some of those Sundays too. But what she says is that I want to give him what I found in the world, which is to say a path and a little light to see by. And that's what we find when we come here and worship together. We discover the path and we find a little light to see by. And I immediately thought of, this is our middle school mission trip. We take the middle schoolers to a local Episcopal church in Salter Path, North Carolina that has a labyrinth. And we let them walk that labyrinth. For most of them, it's the first time they've ever done anything like this. But this is a very active way of worshiping. And you can certainly walk a labyrinth by yourself and have it be an incredibly powerful and meaningful experience. But when you've got, 20 teenagers, you kind of need to do it all together so it doesn't take 5 hours. So we do it as a community. And they are bonded over this shared experience of walking the labyrinth while also having a space to be in prayer and in oneness with God. So this is a way that we find a path and a little light to see by. For Borg, the earliest title for Christians rings true. We are people of the way. This way, Borg writes, in the heart of Christianity, is comprised of practices that help us to pay attention to God and be open to receive the presence of Jesus. How do we do that in church? We pray prayers, we sing hymns, we participate in a sacrament, and these are the practices that help form our identity and shape our character. They hold us accountable, just as practices in other areas of our life do. And importantly, these practices nourish us. They feed our souls. The gift of a church community, and at its core, the gift of worship, is that we can bring all of ourselves and our lives, the full catastrophe, to Jesus' table and rise from our worship blessed. Isn't that awesome? Now, I must have looked to full catastrophe last Sunday because Chris saw me at the Hotel Roanoke and promptly gave me Monday and Tuesday off from work. But that's just it. We can bring our full catastrophe with us when we walk through these doors. You can bring your exhaustion, whether it's physical, as it was for me last Sunday, or mental or emotional. We can bring our joys through the doors and rise from our worship blessed. And that is a gift. That is a gift. That's why we come and we worship together in this community, because we're on the road to Emmaus together. We are on the road together. All right. Hear a word of encouragement to all who are, hang with me, hear a word of encouragement to all who are part of a worshiping community or long to be, but feel the constant pull of other commitments. Am I speaking to anybody? That conspire to take you away from a weekly practice of worship. We live in a 24/7 world, and Sunday is no longer a day of rest in our culture if it ever was. Does anybody else's steering wheel look like that? Now, I've got a phone with a Google Calendar, but y'all, it's color-coded just like this is. It's got to be. But whether you have a family with young children or you've got teenagers that are going all kinds of different directions, no matter what your age or stage is, the reality is, the real world outside of those doors is that the modus operandi is busy. We live overscheduled lives in a lot of cases, and we all have a lot of things going on that conspire to pull us away. But what we find is that regular worship with other Christians in a spiritually nourishing environment is food for your soul and a priceless opportunity to experience the presence of Christ in community. Worship is important, but rarely is it urgent. Other claims on our time will almost always feel as if they need to take precedence, and sometimes they do. Sometimes they do. But what is lost when a weekly rhythm of worship is missing is hard to regain. You may not notice it at first, but over time, the absence of communal spiritual sustenance will take its toll. This is not a judgment statement, but if you've ever been away from church for a while, you might understand what that starts to feel like. It can be hard you get out of a habit, and it can be hard to pick that up sometimes. And it's not that we can't experience Jesus' love elsewhere, but there is a particular grace in worship, an abiding presence known to us over time that is worth the effort to be present each week. Presiding Bishop Curry touches on this. He calls our worship strange. He calls our worship a little bit alien. You know, we wear robes in church. He calls it almost like costumes in church. Where else in the world do you make a big fuss over bread and wine and water? Where else in the world do you reverently light candles? And that is what we find when we come to church. It's a way of moving us beyond our contemporary ways of living and walking through the world and coming into ancient practices that connect us with God in that divine way. One of my favorite things to do with our youth, I bring out the dreaded phone basket. Now, I say that kind of lightheartedly, but Seriously, if you want to see some teenagers become legitimately anxious these days, you take away their phone. So I bring out the phone basket, and especially if we're meeting here on a Sunday evening after it's gotten dark, we'll go into the chapel, and we keep the lights low, and everybody gets a little battery-operated candle, and we sit in a circle, and we're just quiet. And then we'll sing a Teze chant, and then we'll go around the circle and share our highs and lows with each other. It's our prayers to the people. They love that. They ask for it sometimes. They ask if we're going to have a little bit of worship time at the end of UIC. That is so countercultural to them. When else do they do that? When else do they do that in their overscheduled, busy lives? But it's so important. And that is the grace that is found in a worshiping community. It's a safe space for them. They'll open up to each other in ways that they might not to their friends during the week. They and you can take the mask off and leave it at the door. Whatever you're carrying, leave it at the door when you come into St. John's, whether it's through this door or into the Commons, and just be. Now, there are times when we need to be in worship for someone else's sake. In worship, as in other places, we're sometimes given the chance to be a living expression of God's love for another, as others are for us. It's a powerful experience when we're aware of what's happening, yet we're often unaware of how we help others feel Jesus' presence with and for them. Surely the fact that we can be expressions of God's love for one another adds another motivation to be present in worship, even when it would be easier to stay home. Not only do we experience God's grace in worship for ourselves, we could very well play a part in the answer to someone else's prayer. Now, I believe I might have used this picture last week too. It's so good, it's so good. But I had to use it again for this particular section of Bishop Buddy's chapter on worship. Because I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it this at Nina's ordination to the diaconate? I believe that's where this picture was taken. Oh, come on, Aunt Bess, you just shrug your shoulders. Come on, Mom. Now, I believe that's where this picture was taken, and the church was full that day. It was a beautiful sight to behold, and everybody in this church showed up for Nina. It was an answer to a whole lot of prayer that she had undergone for years and years and years, and this community showed up for her that day. But it doesn't always have to be this dramatic either. We never know where people are. We don't know what kind of week that each of us has had. And it's important to be there for one another in our joys and in our sorrows and in the midst of our busyness. Whatever point on the spectrum that we're at that week, we show up for each other. And you never know what might happen when you sit down next to someone and say good morning. Don't be afraid to do that. That's why we're here together. Say good morning and honestly say, how are you? And be open to whatever the Holy Spirit might be doing, just in that invitation to open ourselves up to that person. We're here to worship. We're here to focus on God, and we're here to focus on the presence of Jesus in our midst, but we're here for each other too. So that's why it's really important that you are here today, and I'm glad that you are. You'll often hear me refer to the communion table. I like to call it the table of grace. A friend of mine, Anna Hutto, who's an Episcopal singer-songwriter, she wrote a song called The Table of Grace, and that's where I kind of picked it up. But what she says in that song is that the plate's always full, the cup's never empty, and it's never too late. So come and be filled, where love is never ending. You're always welcome at the table of grace. You are always welcome. The person you're sitting next to in the pew is always welcome. We are here to decenter ourselves and recenter on God. So we're going to move into the next video on the Traveling the Way of Love series. It's a really interesting look at a community in Brooklyn, New York that has found a different way of worshiping that's really creative. So I hope that you'll enjoy seeing this.
And I've always liked learning about worship, about the ways all kinds of people gather to thank, praise, and dwell with God. I've worshiped in huge stone cathedrals, tiny clapboard chapels, and a lot of places in between. But a couple of years ago, I heard about a little storefront church with a new, or maybe old, way of gathering. The Reverend Elsa Marty is the pastor at St. Lydia's. We met to talk about how this church worships, an integral part of Christian life and the way of love. Elsa, we are here in Gowanus, Brooklyn. Why are we here?
You're here to learn about St. Lydia's. We are a congregation that worships around a meal together, a sacred meal, like Jesus did with his followers. And we're located here in Gowanus, right by the Gowanus Canal.
Yeah, set the stage for some of our viewers. What kind of things are around us right now?
A lot of trash, barbed wire fences, at the same time as rapid gentrification, rents are going up.
Now that's a situation that I think some of our churches are in right now. You have folks who didn't grow up in the area and wouldn't necessarily darken the door of a traditional church. Tell me about how you all address that.
So we actually meet in a storefront. Our building doesn't really look like a church. We hope to create a space where people can come and feel welcome, even if they haven't always felt welcome at churches before. You have people who grew up with high church liturgy. You have people who were estranged from their evangelical or Roman Catholic upbringings. We have people who did not grow up Christian at all and have discovered something new and exciting here.
So I think that's really cool that you have discerned that this is a great entry point or even staying point for some members of your community who wouldn't go into a traditional church necessarily. I am going to tell the secret that St. Lydia's isn't an Episcopal church. Do you mind telling us a little about where it came from?
St. Lydia's was founded by a woman named Emily Scott after she finished divinity school at Yale. And she moved to New York City and she found that people lived in such small apartments, they didn't have each other over for home-cooked meals. And there was a real hunger to gather together. And gradually the community grew and they started a church. St. Lydia's has incorporated as a Lutheran congregation.
So we are connected, our two churches, through Called to Common Mission.
Yes.
I actually lived in New York for a few years before I moved back to Minnesota, where you're from as well.
Yes.
Great connection.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you can commiserate with me on this a little bit. Back home, when you go and visit folks, you bring a hot dish or a casserole to the rest of the country, right? You just sit and you talk. Sit down and play cribbage?
Yes.
Always play cribbage, good. But when I moved here, I didn't realize how hard it is to get folks to gather together in that kind of intentional way. And it made it really hard to connect with folks on that deeper level. Do you think that's true of the folks at this congregation?
Definitely. I think there's a real hunger for that kind of intimacy around a meal. People find it to be a really helpful way to engage in Christian community in a new way.
And it sounds to me like there is definitely more than just dinner here. Tell me why worship and dinner have gone so well together.
I think it's all about the sacramentality, that this meal is how Jesus welcomes us to the table, and so we turn and share that with others.
You guys have a communion service kind of built into this whole thing.
Absolutely. We start at the table by blessing the bread and sharing it with one another. And we end our meal by drinking from the cup, like Jesus did with his disciples.
You picked a good guy to work off of.
Yeah.
At St. Lydia's, everyone gets a job before dinner, whether it's setting the table, welcoming guests, practicing the service music, or chopping vegetables. Because worship isn't a passive experience. It requires using our hands, our hearts, and our souls.
All right.
Okay, so we have to cut it down, is that right?
Just in sort of small pieces.
Is this fair trade? And should my thumb have come off while I was doing that?
No.
Okay. Just reattach that later. Tell me about where you've been between beautiful Roseville, Minnesota and beautiful Gowanus, Brooklyn.
Well, I went to college at St. Olaf, and then I went to the University of Chicago for my MDiv, and I did a MTH at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. I ended up doing an internship with a Lutheran church in North India. I'm working on my PhD in theology right now.
So what do you do in the afternoons? Because this seems like a really easy morning.
I guess I diced kale.
Given all of those places and things you've experienced, what does it mean for you to be in this little storefront church in Brooklyn?
I think I have a good appreciation of how wide the church is and that there's so many possibilities for the ways we can worship together. God comes to us where we are and meets us in this meal.
Whether it's bread or wine, but also, what is the name of this soup again?
Tunisian chickpea soup.
That's what I was going to guess. So, I hear from people all the time, I'm down with reading the Bible, I'm down with scripture study, but I don't see why I need to be part of an actual worshiping community. I feel like we're losing something when we give up that piece.
I think it's really important that we come together in our embodiedness.
Mm-hmm.
We hear each other's voices. We hold hands here when we pray. You know, in the Bible, Jesus says, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am present.
I think that's right. But what are some of the reasons that you know of that people are really not feeling like they need to be in a worshiping community?
I think sometimes people think that church is like a performance, and they're not perfect enough to be part of that performance. And worship doesn't have to be perfect. It's not polished, it's something that we create together.
So are you saying that I'm not going to meet any perfect people here tonight?
I'm afraid you won't.
We're out of here. We are not perfect. I mean, we are coming not because we want to thank God for how perfect our lives are, but to kind of draw strength from each other and from God in the process.
Well, Jesus came to heal the sick,
Right.
you know? And when we recognize that we need God's grace, that's when our lives are really transformed.
That's right.
After the sermon, we ask congregants to respond to the sermon by sharing a story or an experience. One week, we talked about credit card debt.
Wouldn't know anything about that.
We've talked about mental health issues. I think it is a place where people feel like they can come and be loved as they are.
And isn't that so big a piece of it? We come to worship God. We come to strengthen each other in the process. And we find even more than that every single time. Luke tells us that after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to 2 disciples on the Emmaus Road who couldn't recognize him. He sat down with them to eat, taking bread, blessing it, breaking it, and giving it to them. Their eyes were open and they recognized him. When we come together to worship, whether it's in a pew with our old friends or at a dinner table with a champion shuffleboard player, I hope we can do the same.
Isn't that neat? It's pretty different from what we see here at St. John's, but actually it made me think about when we would do the Fellowship at 5 service a couple of years ago. All of the folks that came to that service were involved in creating the space and bringing it together. And then after the service, I always really felt like it was a continuation of the service when we would gather in the second room for dinner. And we would share that meal together and be in conversation with one another. And it was a beautiful community that was formed during the time that we had the Fellowship at 5 service. But I really like what she says about worship not being a performance. I read an article by the author Sarah Miles recently. She's talking about worship and how there's a difference between doing worship right or well and making worship real. And that is ultimately our goal, is to make worship real. So it's good for us to think about that, reflect on that. What's important to us when we come to worship? Is it that everything is done perfectly? Or is it a sense when we leave this place that we've had a real encounter with Jesus? So we have just a couple more minutes. I want to invite you all to respond and reflect a little bit about what you've been hearing, including the video that we just watched. Just some prompts, some ideas for what you can talk about. Share about a time you experienced God's presence in a worship service. Have you ever participated in worship leadership, and how has that changed your perception of what it means to worship? What are some of the communal worship practices that move you to encounter God and knit you into the body of Christ? And what might prevent you from coming to worship with your community on a weekly basis? not a judgment statement, but just an opportunity to reflect on what those things could be. And could some of those things possibly be removed or changed so that we could have the space and the time to come to worship on a regular basis? So just take a few minutes and you're welcome to respond to these questions. And there's paper on your tables if you'd like to write about it, or certainly talk.
What was the author's name that talked about
Anne Lamott. One of my favorite authors. She's great. L-A-M-O-T. Yeah, just to go through and say why I take my son to church. What's great about this church is
I was just going to say, I think one of that. Out of town doing a thing, you sort of write your shop and realize it's one way.
It's fun to see how they do
The second question, I think participating in the service, whatever way, being invited to a dinner party, this can just do everything. And I much prefer that as well.
I think we had that here in the past, but maybe down there, sure, just take it home with them. They do it all. We didn't participate with the idea several years ago. We sort of temporary music, 5 o'clock service, and we had some talent in the church. And we didn't swim around. To me, that sort of teaching reflected what's in the other church. It was just a different way. It's a different way to worship.
That's where I think Bill and Keith felt like they were having the carry to play. It started out pretty strong, about 40 people that were coming, but then it started to dwindle to around 15, 20. And they couldn't, some of those folks could get here early enough to really help get stuff set up. So it even cost Bill.
If they didn't know it's that big.
So it would start with Rachel Gagan and Louis Dabney. It was more contemporary type music. Some of it was even kind of secular stuff. It couldn't read a spiritual aspect to it. It wasn't pure. And there we would use a lot of Celtic prayers or worship. So it was just a slightly different energy. And then right after the mornings, we would have very simple. It was right around. Actually, we would have, where it is, actually it's the angel that sits on the table in the commons where we do flowers and things. We would bring that upstairs and put that in front of the altar that we would set up. And that's where Anders would sit. He would sit right by the angel and just look at her the whole service. It was so precious. And they would just crawl around. Yeah, it was really laid back to come in That was part of the purpose.
That was part of it.
That was part of the purpose, was to try to get students that would want to come over. At the time, the chaplain that was there was pretty territorial of the school. Yeah, but since they've split, which is Methodist Church, perhaps it's a little bit more permitted. Well, I think she really wanted to make sure that she was doing on campus.
You know, mission actions, sort of pulling it back up and looking at it, because all it's work system and all this additional, there is a little bit of a hunger for different
This is where she's coming from.
If I could have the Episcopal liturgy and some of that music, I'd be a happy girl. A praise band. Last weekend at Convention, we had a praise band for our youth event, and they were the musicians for the Sunday Eucharist. Kristen asked me to ask if we wanted to maybe
When I go to any of it, music to me is more upbeat than the Episcopal music. I think
more contemporary by upbeat, you mean?
No, just more upbeat songs. You know, and it's not them. It's not just us. I think it's the Episcopal church.
there are some things that we want to
Exactly. That's a good way to put it, Carol.
Last year, the first year that we ever had a praise and worship band.
No, we have a praise and worship band at youth convention every year. And they're usually the musicians for the Sunday service. Last year it was next level. And a lot of it was the revival. A lot of it was, honestly, if I have to be honest, I like the band kept this year even better than mine. So we had a revival. They were really good. Well, Sam is the lead musician. I used to babysit him growing up. So it was a lot of fun to have. He grew up in Great Memorial. They're from Nashville, so it's not exactly a quick jump over. All right, we can certainly continue these conversations, and I hope that we do, but I know that we need to get down to church here in just a few minutes. But thank you for engaging in these conversations. I think they're important, and I hope that they're helping you all start to find ways to incorporate these practices into your daily lives. And just a last reminder, may God bless each of us as we walk our road to Emmaus. Jesus meets us there. Sometimes we don't recognize him, but he is there. May we all experience those brief, powerful encounters as we gather in worship and he reveals himself to us in scripture and in the breaking of bread. And even today, it's Candlemas. So we're going to bless the candles and welcome that light. So even today, when we are doing that as well, you can find the presence of Jesus in those beautiful candles that will light. So thank you so much for being here this morning. Let's go worship if you haven't worshiped yet, and we'll come back together next week, and we're going to have some fun blessing each other. Thank you.